Shannon thought the DJ at the reception had a flawless track record of playing songs she hated. Though she hadn't wanted to attend the wedding, Robert's old college roommate was getting married, leaving her with no choice. She wondered where her husband was and spotted him by the bar, deep in conversation with a stranger. Feeling dismayed, she thought the event was worse than attending someone else's high school reunion. Her mood lifted when a familiar voice called out, and she saw a young woman her age with a drink in hand. Tracy, her high school best friend, had arrived. They hugged excitedly before Tracy introduced her boyfriend, Darren. Shannon noted Darren's tall stature, jet black hair, dark stubble, and distinctive silver earring. His outfit of tight black jeans, a leather bomber jacket, and a t-shirt stood out among the more formally dressed men. Shannon envied Tracy's choice of a bad boy. As Tracy and Shannon chatted animatedly, Darren looked around with a hint of contempt. Tracy, noticeably loud and tipsy from several trips to the bar, provided a welcome distraction for Shannon. When their conversation paused, Darren asked Tracy why she had called Shannon PK. Tracy laughed loudly and explained it was because Shannon was a preacher's kid, a label she carried from her father's position as a Methodist minister in suburban Philadelphia. Despite the expectations placed on her to be a role model, Shannon had rebelled in every possible way, much to her parents' dismay. In school, Shannon was smart but struggled with grades and discipline. By 14, she was sneaking out to meet disreputable boys, experimenting with pills and alcohol, and had a pregnancy scare that led her to always use contraception. Her parents disapproved of her choice in boys and tried setting her up with more suitable dates, but Shannon defied them. In her junior year, Shannon's boyfriend picked her up for a date but had another girl in the car. After a jealous outburst, Shannon stayed home, only to learn later that both her boyfriend and the girl had died in a car accident. Her parents, though disliking the boyfriend, insisted she attend the funeral. The event made Shannon rethink her life, leading her to focus more on her studies and cut back on partying. Her parents saw this change as divine intervention. Shannon's new dedication earned her a spot at the Community College of Philadelphia, where she began studying business administration. Her father, impressed by her transformation, encouraged her to join singles activities at his parish and introduced her to Robert Cunningham, a newcomer to the church. Robert was tall and clean-cut with wavy brown hair. Though handsome, he was too conventional for Shannon, who preferred bad boys. Her opinion changed when she discovered he was an FBI agent, which sparked her interest. Robert, in turn, was captivated by Shannon's looks and shared values. Soon they became a couple, and Shannon's parents were thrilled. By graduation, Shannon and Robert were engaged. "Now we're living the dream," Shannon said to Tracy, her sarcasm unmistakable. Tracy picked up on the tone and asked, "So where's your husband?" Shannon's response dripped with disdain. "You mean SpongeBob SquarePants?" Tracy chuckled. "What did you call him?" "SpongeBob SquarePants," Shannon repeated, her bitterness evident. "I use that nickname because he's so dull and he's draining all the fun from my life." Tracy laughed at her comment. "Come on, Shannon, I thought you married someone like the Lone Ranger mixed with Elliot Ness," Tracy joked. Shannon clearly took offense. "More like I married a boring accountant," she retorted. "Actually, that's not even fair to accountants. I don't even know what he does for a living. He never discusses his job. When he comes home, all he wants to do is lounge around. There's no excitement or fun in my life anymore." Shannon was about to say more when she noticed Robert approaching. He had been on his cell phone and looked apologetic. Before he could speak, Shannon introduced him to Tracy and her date. Robert shook hands and then told Shannon that they needed to leave early because he was on call and had work issues. Shannon, already displeased with the reception, was further dismayed by the thought of spending the evening at home alone. Tracy quickly offered to give Shannon a ride with her and Darren. Robert, uncertain about Tracy and uneasy about Darren, hesitated but eventually agreed, instructing Shannon not to wait up. After Robert left to speak to the bride and groom, Shannon thanked Tracy and suggested getting another drink. Darren proposed leaving the dull reception for somewhere more exciting. Tracy agreed, and despite her initial hesitation, Shannon decided to join them. Outside, Shannon was surprised to see Darren and Tracy heading for a motorcycle. Excited, she asked if they could all fit. Tracy confirmed, and Darren dismissed the need for helmets, saying, "Helmets are for sissies." Darren mounted the motorcycle and watched as Shannon adjusted her skirt and climbed on behind him. Her actions seemed to excite him, and she felt a thrill at the thought of impressing this bad boy. Once Tracy was settled behind Shannon, Darren roared off, revving the engine and speeding away from the wedding. Shannon squealed, both thrilled and frightened. clinging to Darren as he turned sharply. His grin made her long for the excitement her husband lacked. Arriving at their destination, Shannon realized they had come to a dance club. The vibrant music and flashing lights quickly reminded her of her wilder days, and she nearly danced with joy as they entered. Tracy headed straight for the bar, eager for shots, but Darren pulled Shannon aside. Shouting over the noise, he offered her something he claimed was better than alcohol. Intrigued, Shannon agreed, and Darren produced 2 pastel-colored tablets. After swallowing one himself, he handed one to her. "You're going to love Molly," he said with a conspiratorial smile. They joined Tracy at the bar, and Darren urged them all to dance. The 3 of them squeezed into the crowd and danced together. Shannon leaned in to ask Darren if Tracy liked Molly. Darren shook his head. Booze was Tracy's thing, and sure enough, Tracy soon returned with another shot glass. As Shannon danced, a warm, euphoric feeling took over her. The music, lights, and the closeness of Darren and Tracy created a unique sensation. Eventually, Tracy found a chair and passed out, which left Darren free to focus on Shannon. She felt euphoric and wished the night would last forever. Later, Darren picked up Tracy and carried her to his motorcycle. He propped her on the seat and gestured for Shannon to get on behind him. They rode, with Shannon feeling the wind and vibrations, until they reached an apartment building. Darren carried Tracy inside and laid her on the couch. Shannon followed, still swaying to the music in her head. Darren's intense gaze ignited her own desire, and without a word, he led her to the bedroom. They began kissing passionately and quickly fell onto the unmade bed. As Shannon began to feel exhausted, Darren increased his pace and thrust with greater intensity. Caught up in his urgency, she opened herself fully and felt an overwhelming pressure building inside her. Her body reached a peak, and she screamed in ecstasy, experiencing an orgasm unlike anything before. It felt as though the entire session had surged into a powerful wave that engulfed her. When she finally looked up, Darren was dressing. She propped herself on her elbows, groggy but awed, and asked how long they had been together. Darren smirked and checked his watch, revealing that it had been about 2 hours. Shocked, Shannon questioned the duration, and Darren's grin confirmed the influence of Molly. Exhausted, she remarked that she would never be the same. Realizing the time, Shannon asked what time it was, and gasped when Darren replied it was nearly 2 o'clock. Panicking, she quickly dressed while Darren waited. As they left the apartment, Shannon saw Tracy still passed out on the couch and felt a pang of guilt. The ride home, though only 15 minutes, felt interminable to Shannon. She struggled to think of an excuse for her late return. When they arrived, she scrambled off the bike, mumbled a hasty thank you to Darren, and watched as he drove away with a wave. As Shannon approached the house, her fear surged. She quietly unlocked the door, hoping Robert was asleep so she could slip into bed unnoticed and make up an excuse in the morning. To her relief, Robert was not in the bedroom. Grateful, she quickly undressed and hid her clothes in the laundry basket. She skipped the shower to avoid taking too long and instead put on her nightgown and got into bed, sighing in relief. Her relief turned to anxiety when she heard Robert's key in the door. A disturbing thought crossed her mind. What if he wanted to make love? She had taken precautions, but she worried he might still discover something. Determined to avoid any further issues, she decided to confront him with anger. As he entered the bedroom, she turned on the bedside lamp and demanded to know where he had been. Robert, startled, claimed he had been out on business. Shannon accused him of seeing someone else, and despite his protests of love and innocence, she pressed him for details. Exhausted and frustrated from the night's events, Robert was pushed to his limits by her accusations. Robert wearily explained, "I had to investigate a crime scene." Shannon pressed him further. "Crime happens every day. Why was this so urgent?" Robert's voice grew cold. It was a double ending. 2 suspects we were tracking got executed. The criminals dragged them to a landfill, forced them to kneel, and did that in the head, he continued, bitterness in his tone. They put bags to prevent brain matter from splattering everywhere. Robert described the scene in grim detail, shaking his head. When the medical examiner removed the bags, there wasn't much left of their faces. He finished dressing, climbed into bed, and turned his back. Shannon, pale and shaken, switched off the light and pulled the covers around her. As she lay down, she noticed her tender skin and thought, what a wild night. But as she drifted to sleep, her last thought was of the execution Robert had described, regretting pushing him so hard. Shannon slept until noon and found Robert cool but warming up as the afternoon progressed. Despite his improving mood, Shannon felt increasingly depressed. The excitement of Saturday night had stirred up old desires, making her mundane routine seem even more unbearable. The next morning, her work at the school district of Philadelphia as an administrative assistant felt as monotonous as ever. Her degree had landed her the job, but dealing with her lecherous boss was a chore, and the routine was draining. Monday brought an unexpected surprise. When the director introduced his visitor, Shannon nearly gasped. It was Darren, though dressed in a suit and missing his signature earring. He acknowledged her with a faint grin, but offered no other sign of recognition. As the two men entered the director's office, Shannon's curiosity got the better of her. She used the office intercom system to eavesdrop on their conversation. To her surprise, Darren was pitching cleaning and office supplies, a stark contrast to his bad boy image from Saturday night. The negotiations seemed odd, with Darren trying to establish a new business relationship despite the director's initial disinterest. Darren confidently pitched a 10% commission offer to the director, emphasizing that the same rate applied to any order size. The director asked how the commission would be paid, and Darren suggested a cashier's check to bypass red tape. The director agreed to place an order, and Darren promised the commission check by the next morning. However, Darren added that due to previous issues with order cancellations, the company now required simultaneous payment by cashier's check for the order. Shannon heard the director's chair snap upright. "This is unusual," he grumbled. "I'm not sure I can issue a cashier's check for such a large amount." Darren smoothly countered that the offer was equally unusual and suggested the director might consider reducing the order if needed. After a pause, the director agreed, but requested Darren return before noon due to a supposed luncheon. Shannon knew the director was eager to deposit the check quickly and shut off the intercom as the men left the office. She pretended to work as Darren left without acknowledging her. Driving home, Shannon reflected on the bribe she had overheard and questioned Darren's real motives and the need for cashier's checks. Disgusted by the director's willingness to accept the bribe, she briefly considered reporting it but dismissed the idea. Her thoughts lingered on Darren and she dreamed about him that night. The next morning, Darren arrived at the building to find the director eagerly ushering him into his office, barking at Shannon to avoid interruptions. As soon as the door closed, Shannon turned on the intercom. Darren's voice, smooth and confident, informed the director that he had the commission and presented a cashier's check before seeing the order and payment. The director, anxious but pleased, accepted the check and handed over the school district's check for the agreed amount. Darren assured him that their arrangement would be profitable and reminded him it would apply to future orders. The director mentioned a luncheon and left, prompting Shannon to take her own lunch break. Shannon hurried to her car, driving to the shabby apartments from Saturday night. She waited until she saw Darren arrive and then ran to catch him. Darren's initial surprise gave way to a wary look as he let her in. Inside, Shannon confronted Darren, revealing that she had overheard the bribery scheme and suspected he was a con man. Darren confirmed her suspicions, admitting the check he gave the director was fake, while the district's check was real and had already been cashed. Shannon asked about the consequences if the director tried to cash his check and discovered it was a fraud. His smirk grew even more arrogant. "The best part about this setup is that he's trapped no matter what. If he tries to report me, he has to admit he accepted a bribe. He probably won't do that until he's forced to explain the missing cleaning supplies. By that time, I'll be long gone." Then Darren's gaze became intense. "So, how much do you want to stay silent?" "I don't want your money," she replied calmly. He looked genuinely taken aback this time. "No? So, what do you want instead?" She fixed him with a steady stare. "I want you to take me with you." Her response clearly surprised him, and he paused for a moment, considering. Gradually, his expression softened, and his smile reappeared. "Are you really sure about this? Do you want to leave your loving husband, your cozy suburban home, and your steady 9-to-5 job?" he asked with mock incredulity. "Are you truly ready to give all that up to run away with me?" A fierce determination filled her face. "I feel like I've been searching for someone like you my entire life," she said with passion, and then she threw herself at him, kissing him deeply. His hands moved down. Shannon started to pant, but Darren pulled her hair, forcing her to look into his eyes. "I'm leaving town now. I'll be outside your house in an hour. If you're not ready, I'm leaving without you." "We're taking your motorcycle?" she asked. "No, a car. Sometimes you leave your toys behind." "What about Stacy?" "Like I said, you have to leave your toys behind. Be outside by 1:30 or I'll leave you too." Shannon kissed him and rushed out. She drove to the bank, withdrew money, and hurried home. She packed a suitcase and a makeup bag with essentials, then left a note saying sorry and her wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Sitting on the porch, doubt gnawed at her. This was the craziest thing she had ever done, but when a nondescript sedan arrived, she ran to it, leaving the apartment door unlocked. She threw her bags in the back and got into the passenger seat as Darren drove away. As they left, Shannon thought of Robert and felt a pang of guilt. She knew this would hurt him, and she also worried about her parents' disappointment. But she resolved, "It's my life, and I'm taking control." The next few months passed in a blur for Shannon. Darren drove them south to Wilmington, where they settled into a cheap motel, living a life of smoky nightclubs, pills-induced haze, and spontaneous act. They lived entirely on impulse, embracing a carefree existence with no responsibilities or accountability. Shannon relished the freedom, enjoying long sleeps after partying all night and escaping her past. Although she occasionally thought of her parents and Robert, she dismissed these thoughts, telling herself, that was then. This is now. One afternoon, Darren woke her with an unexpected request. "We're low on money," he said. "You need to get a job." Shannon, still groggy, asked, "What kind of job?" "You're becoming a legal secretary," Darren replied. "But I don't know anything about legal work." "You'll learn," he said. "But first, we need to shop." That afternoon, they visited Nordstrom's at Christiana Mall. While Shannon browsed the women's department, she saw Darren a few aisles away. She selected a black Alexander Wang pencil skirt, tried it on, and then left it slightly askew on the rack. Next, she found a white blouse, tried it on, and returned it similarly. In the shoe department, she bought a pair of $300 black high-heeled pumps with cash. Afterward, she relaxed in the food court, where Darren soon joined her with a bag from Champ Sports. "Did you get everything?" Shannon asked anxiously. When Darren nodded, she asked, "Shouldn't we leave?" "Nah," he said dismissively. "We're clear." "How can you be sure?" she pressed. "Simple," he replied. "Stores aren't looking for a man to shoplift women's clothes. Someone might have seen you browsing, but they don't pay much attention to a guy in the women's department." "Then why did I have to buy those expensive shoes?" she asked, still uneasy. "3 reasons," Darren explained. "First, shoes are hard to swipe because staff keep a close eye. Second, expensive footwear often has ID chips that need disabling. And third, if anyone was suspicious, they'd forget the moment you made a purchase. A shoplifter wouldn't buy anything, especially something that costly." Despite his reassurances, Shannon was relieved when they returned to the motel. Darren turned on the Weather Channel, then said, "Looks like tomorrow's good for hunting pigeons. Here's the plan." Shannon was unhappy about becoming part of Darren's con game. She had no choice, so the next day she nervously headed toward DuPont Park, dressed in the clothes Darren had shoplifted. She hoped to pass as the secretary she was supposed to be. She spotted Darren across the street, half a block ahead. At the park, he gave a subtle signal, directing her to a man sitting on a bench near the fountain. The man, in his late 60s with thinning gray hair and an older suit, was her target. Taking a deep breath, Shannon approached him. "Sir, excuse me, sir, I think you dropped this," she said, holding up an oversized, unmarked envelope. The man glanced at Shannon, taking in both the envelope she held and her appearance. Darren knew what he was doing, Shannon thought approvingly. "No, that doesn't belong to me," he said with a smile. "Are you sure?" Shannon asked, noting it was under the bench where he sat. He shook his head again. "No, it's not mine, but thank you." Shannon sat beside him, noticing his gaze on the slit in her skirt. "What should we do about this envelope? It feels heavy." She handed it to him, and he weighed it before returning it. "Maybe there's an address inside," Shannon suggested, meeting his gaze. "That's a good idea," he said, clearly enjoying her company. When Shannon opened the envelope, she gasped. "Oh my gosh, it's filled with money!" She handed it back to him, and he was visibly shocked. "How much is in there?" she asked. He counted the stacks of $100 bills and said, "There are 20 packets, each with 25 bills. That's $50,000. Shannon's eyes widened. "Can we keep it? There's no name or indication of ownership. That's $25,000 each." He hesitated but was tempted. "We should report it to the authorities just in case someone lost it, but if no one claims it, maybe we can keep it." Shannon had an idea. Her boss, an attorney working in the building across the street, could provide guidance. She called him and, after a brief conversation, told the man her boss was on his way and pointed out Darren, who arrived in a dark blue suit with a briefcase. Darren examined the envelope and identified it as pills money, explaining that something had gone wrong with a payoff. He said they would need to notify the police, but once the formalities were complete, the money would belong to them. Excited, Shannon hugged the older man, who returned the embrace. Darren then mentioned a complication. Pills dealers sometimes use unmarked envelopes to launder money, claiming it as a fine to later take possession of clean cash. To address this, Darren suggested they show their good faith by each adding some of their own money to the mix, which would help convince the police they were genuine finders. Seeing the older man's hesitation, Shannon quickly agreed to the idea of showing good faith. She offered to withdraw over $25,000 from her savings and asked her companion if he could do the same. He agreed, deciding to withdraw $25,000 from his retirement account. Darren instructed them to withdraw the money, place it in envelopes with receipts, and return quickly. Excited, Shannon and her new friend went to their banks. When they returned, Darren added their envelopes to the $50,000 they had found, sealed it, and remarked that this would prove the money hadn't been tampered with. He then claimed the police were delayed due to an accident and suggested they store the money in a safer place until the detectives arrived. He directed the older man to place the money in his car's trunk and assured them he would inform the police of its location. The three walked across the street and into the garage, with the older man leading the way to his Chevrolet. As they approached the car, Shannon dropped her phone and made a show of picking it up, catching the older man staring at her. She handed him the phone while Darren switched the envelope with the money for a similar one from his briefcase. Darren then placed the new envelope in the car's trunk, slammed it shut, and asked the older man to relock the car. He checked his watch, apologized for needing to leave, and told them to wait by the car for the police. As Darren hurried away, Shannon engaged the older man in conversation about what he planned to do with the money. She then excused herself to use the bathroom, gave him a kiss on the cheek, and left for the lobby. Instead of stopping, Shannon exited the building and walked down the street to an alley where Darren was waiting. After getting into the car, Darren congratulated her on the successful con, amused by the older man's reaction to her bending over. She asked, "How long do you think it will take before he finds the trunk and discovers that envelope full of newspaper?" Darren responded, "It'll be a long time after we're gone." With a playful laugh, she leaned back in her seat as they made their way to the motel. Once they arrived at the motel, Darren glanced over at Shannon. "Why don't you head inside and wait for me? I need to make a quick stop at the bank." Shannon looked puzzled and asked, "What bank?" "The Bank of Moscow," Darren replied casually. Surprised, she asked, "The Bank of Moscow? I've never heard of it. Why do you need to go there?" Darren's tone turned terse as he said, "It's better if you don't know." Noticing her displeasure, he quickly added, "We'll go out and have some fun when I get back." While she waited for Darren, Shannon reflected on their recent actions. As the thrill of the scam faded, she found herself thinking about the elderly man they had just robbed. A pang of guilt surfaced as she remembered his worn clothes, but she tried to push the feeling away. "He probably has plenty of money saved up," she reassured herself. "He won't even notice it's gone." Still, she felt a twinge of sadness. She had sought the excitement of being with a troublemaker, but hadn't anticipated being involved in his schemes. "My dad would be horrified if he knew," she thought. "And so would Robert." This thought made her angry with herself. "Why should I care about their opinions?" she muttered in frustration. To lift her spirits, she pulled out a joint from Darren's bag and lit it up. By the time Darren came back, she was high, giggling and craving food. Darren found her state amusing. "Come on, sweetheart," he said. "Let's grab a bite to eat and then have some fun." A week later, Darren told Shannon it was time for them to move on. "We're leaving as soon as I get back," he said. When she asked about his destination, he only mentioned a business meeting. After Darren returned, they quickly packed their bags into their unremarkable car. Darren paid their bill at the motel office, then got behind the wheel and drove north on I-95. Shannon asked if they were returning to Philadelphia, but Darren informed her they were headed to Newark instead for a significant business opportunity. Darren explained that Newark's troubled education system, which had been state-run since 1995 due to corruption and underfunding, was now attracting substantial donations for quick fixes. The current initiative involved distributing computers to students. Darren revealed their plan to exploit this by offering a shipping container of iPads at cut-rate prices, a scheme they could pull off with funding from the so-called Bank of Moscow, a Russian mafia front that finances scams. The mafia benefits by making money without taking on direct risk. If the con fails or borrowers are arrested, the responsibility for repayment falls on the borrower's family. Shannon remained unconvinced and questioned the consequences if the family couldn't or wouldn't pay. Darren warned her about the severe repercussions from the Bank of Moscow, which always collects on its loans. She inquired about the source of the shipping container of iPads, and Darren explained that it was hijacked. The plan involved the Bank of Moscow lending the iPads in seed money, taking half of the proceeds from the con. Despite Shannon's concern about the risk, Darren emphasized the potential $2 million profit from selling the iPads at half price. They would split $4 million with the bank. Shannon was skeptical about conning the school board into buying stolen merchandise. Darren assured her that their contact, Gordon Sesterman, head of Newark's Future Today Foundation, was politically ambitious and not very discerning about campaign funds. He then revealed that Shannon would be the one executing the con, with Darren coaching her through the process. The day after checking into a budget motel near Newark Airport, Darren and Shannon went to Manhattan for a shopping spree. They returned with a new wardrobe for Shannon, including lingerie from Agent Provocateur, an Armani suit from Saks Fifth Avenue, and Burberry ankle boots. Shannon paid cash only for the boots. That evening, Darren reviewed Shannon's role and how to handle potential questions from Gordon Sesterman. He had already arranged the meeting, introducing Shannon as Miss April Johnson, Vice President of Sales for Global Resources. Darren reassured her that focusing on the rewards would convince Sesterman of the offer's legitimacy. Shannon spent a restless night, anxious about both the role and her involvement in Darren's schemes. The next morning, she was too nervous to eat but felt better once dressed in her suit and boots. Darren reminded her to use her charm to her advantage. At Sesterman's office, Shannon presented her pitch about offering 10,000 iPads at half price. Despite her doubts about the story, she noticed that Sesterman seemed more focused on her appearance than her words. She tested this by crossing and uncrossing her legs, and Sesterman watched intently. As Shannon saw Sesterman's reaction, her confidence grew. She shifted focus from the deal to praising the foundation's work and Sesterman's role, highlighting the political benefits of acquiring the tablets. She suggested that such a move could significantly boost his public image and open doors for a mayoral campaign. Leaning toward him, her jacket gaped to reveal glimpses of her bra, which seemed to further captivate him. Shannon continued smoothly, offering seed money for a campaign, proposing 1% of the retail value as a commission, $80,000. Sesterman's eyes widened at the figure, but he needed more time to consider. Shannon acknowledged his need for time, but hinted at other potential buyers, emphasizing the importance of quick turnover. Sesterman agreed to a follow-up meeting the next day. Shannon left his office with a confident sway in her hips, eager to share her success with Darren. She excitedly described the positive response she received, and Darren was thrilled, seeing the potential for a $2 million payout and the freedom it would bring. In his intense passion, Darren pulled her close and kissed her deeply. Almost immediately, her excitement shifted to pure desire, and they hurriedly removed their clothes, collapsing onto the disheveled bed in a frenzy of lust. As he entered her, he taunted, "Are you missing your old life now? Do you wish you were back with SpongeBob?" Holding him tightly, she cried out in pleasure, "Forget about him and everyone else. This is what I want. Just give it to me, right now." The next day, when Shannon came back for her follow-up appointment, she was dressed in another outfit she had stolen. Although it was still business appropriate, it featured a shorter skirt and a blouse with a plunging neckline. She walked confidently into Sesterman's office, and his initial reaction only boosted her confidence. "Miss Johnson, I've reviewed your company's proposal thoroughly, and I find it very intriguing," he said. She thought to herself, "He's hooked," as she tried to hide her satisfaction. Sesterman continued, "However, during my investigation, I stumbled upon an interesting case that I'd like to discuss with you. About 9 months ago, the Philadelphia school system placed a large order for cleaning supplies from a new vendor. When the supplies never arrived, an inquiry was launched. It turns out that the head of purchasing admitted to accepting a bribe from the fake supplier." Fear replaced Shannon's earlier excitement as she thought, "Oh no, he knows about us. The police must be outside, ready to arrest me." Her heart raced, and sweat began to bead down her sides. It took all her willpower not to flee. "But what really caught my interest," Sesterman continued, "was that the bribe the purchasing director received was a cashier's check. Ironically, that cashier's check was just as fraudulent as the supply contract." Shannon felt dizzy, wondering if she might faint. Sesterman smiled and said he'd accept the proposal, but with 3 conditions. Shannon was confused and relieved, wondering if she was actually getting the deal. Sesterman continued with his conditions. First, the campaign contribution must be $80,000 in cash, delivered with the merchandise. Shannon was troubled by how they would manage that. Second, he needed to see all 10,000 iPads before buying. Finally, Sesterman demanded a night at the Meadowlands Hilton with him. Shocked, Shannon struggled to stay composed. She told Sesterman she needed to discuss this with her colleagues and left. Sesterman reminded her to decide quickly, as his offer was time-sensitive. Shannon was furious but said nothing more. When she arrived back at the motel, Darren could instantly see her frustration. Before she could even explain, he jumped in with, "What happened? What went wrong?" Upon hearing about Sesterman's demand for cash, Darren didn't view it as a major obstacle. "I didn't see that coming, but it's manageable. I'll talk to the Russians and figure something out." Similarly, Darren wasn't deterred by Sesterman's request to inspect the merchandise. "The Russians have the container at Port Newark. I'll arrange a special viewing for Sesterman when I discuss the $80,000 with them. This can work in our favor, Shannon. Everything will be fine." Shannon's frustration grew with each passing moment. "No, it won't," she yelled, "because I am not going to sleep with that jerk." Darren was shocked by her reaction. "That's his third condition?" he asked. "He wants to sleep with you? This is perfect. He's interested. We've got him hooked." Shannon was stunned by his attitude. "I'm not a hoe," she argued. "I don't want to spend the night with that self-righteous bastard." With a tight grip on her shoulders, Darren made her wince. "Get real, Shannon," he shouted. "It's time you realize that you have to use every tool at your disposal in this game. Yesterday, you were all about flirting and showing a little skin. You're already using sex to sell. Just use a bit more to close the deal." "How will you feel about me if I do this?" Shannon asked, tears welling up. "What will this do to us?" Darren embraced her, then lifted her chin to meet her gaze. "Oh, sweetheart, I'll admire you even more if you pull this off. This is like winning the World Series. It's a huge deal. One night with a target means nothing to me." Shannon looked up at Darren, uncertain but feeling pressured. She hadn't wanted to be part of the con and felt used. The look in Darren's eyes hadn't reassured her, but she wanted to make him proud and enjoy the rewards the job could bring. Reluctantly, she agreed to go along with his plan. With that settled, Darren focused on Sesterman's conditions and proposed a strategy. "Now that we have him, we can use the cash as leverage." Following Darren's advice, Shannon called Sesterman to confirm the deal and set up a meeting at the hotel in 2 nights. Sesterman was thrilled until Miss Johnson added a condition. "If you want our campaign contribution in cash, you'll need to pay for the computers in cash too." Sesterman protested, but Shannon interrupted. "Fair is fair. To ensure neither side is scammed, everyone must be on equal footing." Sesterman was furious. "How can I possibly get $2 million in cash? The largest bill is $100, and that amount of cash would be enormous." Shannon looked at Darren nervously, but he urged her to stay firm. She resumed the call and said, "If you can't manage cash, offer us an alternative, or the deal is off." After a tense pause, Sesterman suggested, "What about Eurobonds? They're like cash. The foundation has plenty. Could that work?" When Shannon looked at Darren, he shrugged and quickly scribbled a note, holding it up for her to see. "Let me consult with our financial people, Mr. Sesterman," Shannon said. "I'll call you back within the hour." After hanging up, Darren called his Russian contact and explained the situation, listening intently before ending the call. "What did they say?" Shannon asked anxiously. "They said Eurobonds are like bearer bonds. Whoever holds them can redeem them for cash. They're often used for laundering money. As long as the bonds are legitimate, they'll accept them." "So what does that mean?" Shannon asked. Darren, excited, began to pace. "It means we've got him. He wants this deal badly. He's probably already drafting his campaign announcement." Once they calmed down, Shannon called Sesterman back and confirmed that Eurobonds were acceptable. The deal was set. Despite her initial excitement, Shannon's emotions wavered. Darren praised her constantly, making her feel important. But she sometimes felt like just a pawn in his game. The thought of Sesterman forcing her to service men in bed bothered her less than Darren's willingness to put her in that position. Despite her doubts, Shannon found herself at the Meadowlands Hilton 2 days later, dressed in a dark gray maxi dress with a low-cut back, highlighting her braless figure. The outfit, which Darren had helped her procure, was both sophisticated. Arriving early, Shannon positioned herself across the lobby. When Sesterman entered and noticed her, she turned to reveal the back of her dress, prompting him to rush over. During dinner with several bottles of wine, Sesterman boasted about his foundation's achievements, attributing them all to himself. Although Shannon appeared captivated, her thoughts drifted as she spotted a man resembling her father, sparking rebellious memories. "I'll do what I want," she thought, embracing her role. Interrupting Sesterman's monologue, she purred. "Why don't we take a bottle of wine upstairs and continue the conversation?" He eagerly agreed, and they headed to his room. In the elevator, Shannon took charge, pulling him close for a passionate kiss. In the room, She took swigs from the wine bottle, then seductively removed her dress to reveal only her pumps and a black thong. She then guided Sesterman's head between her legs, commanding him to eat me. After several minutes, she pulled him up for another kiss and ordered, "Now, take your clothes off." When she woke up the next morning, sunlight was pouring in through the windows. Her head was pounding from a hangover, and her mouth felt like it had been filled with spoiled food. As she blinked her eyes open and peered over the edge of the bed, she could only see a pair of legs clad in suit pants and dress shoes standing in front of her. The memory of Sesterman forcing her into BJ. Trying to hide her revulsion, she grabbed the bedsheet to clean his semen from her face while he fastened his pants. Afterward, he plopped down in a nearby chair and said bluntly, "Let's get down to business." It was obvious to Shannon that the calm demeanor he had shown the night before had vanished by morning. "This is how it's going to work," he stated sharply. "You need to be at my office at 5 p.m. today with the $80,000 in cash, carried in a briefcase. Come alone. Bring no one with you or the deal is off. I'll have the Eurobonds ready. You count the money while I verify the bonds to make sure everything is legitimate." Sesterman outlined the plan. They would drive to a storage locker he rented, each with a heavy-duty padlock. They'd lock up the money so neither could tamper with it, then inspect the iPads at the terminal. After confirming the merchandise, they'd return to the locker and collect their money. He warned her to avoid tricks and made a crude remark before leaving. Back at the motel, Darren eagerly asked about the meeting, particularly the details of Sesterman's demands. He seemed focused on figuring out how to handle the situation and promised to talk to the Russians to make plans. While Darren worked on that, Shannon packed their belongings, feeling a mix of depression and self-doubt. Sesterman's behavior had made her feel ashamed, but she tried to lift her spirits by imagining what she could do with the money, like visiting Paris. She felt a bit better just as Darren returned. Darren entered the motel room with a large briefcase, announcing they had everything planned. Inside were $80,000, which Shannon needed to protect until it was locked in the storage unit. He warned her that any mishap could attract the Russians' wrath. Shannon asked how it would work, but Darren said it was better she didn't know to avoid accidental leaks. He then briefed her on a final acting role needed to close the deal, which Shannon confidently agreed to. At 5 p.m., Darren dropped Shannon off at the Foundation offices with the briefcase. She was surprised by its weight and felt the burden of responsibility. Sesterman greeted her and tried to take the briefcase, but she held on until he assured her he just needed to count it. He showed her the Eurobonds and offered to let her verify them. Shannon checked the bonds and emailed a photo to her contact. Shortly after, she received confirmation that the bonds were real. Sesterman then led her to his Mercedes and drove to a secluded self-storage facility, explaining he chose it to avoid disturbance. Sesterman pulled up to a roll-up door and unlocked it. Inside the storage unit, there was only a shelf along one wall. He placed his briefcase on the shelf and signaled for Shannon to do the same with hers. They locked the unit with both their padlocks, ensuring neither could access it without the other. After securing the storage unit, they got back in the car. Sesterman drove east, merging onto Lincoln Highway and then turning onto Port Street. He navigated through the Port Newark Container Terminal, a vast area filled with colorful shipping containers and towering cranes. Shannon directed him through the maze of containers until they reached a bright blue one. She checked the container number against her notes and handed Sesterman the key. He unlocked and opened the container, revealing it packed with large boxes marked with the Apple logo. Sesterman eagerly opened a box and pulled out an iPad, clearly pleased. Shannon reminded him to check the boxes at the back to confirm they all contained iPads. As he moved towards the back, Shannon tried to close the container door. The locking pole jammed, and despite her efforts, she couldn't close it. Sesterman, hearing the commotion, turned and yelled at her. As he scrambled back towards the front, Shannon ran down the alley between the containers, heading for the street. Enraged, Sesterman scrambled out of the container and chased after Shannon, who had jumped into Darren's car. He sprinted back to his Mercedes to follow them, but was blocked by an 18-wheeler that had just pulled across the alley entrance. Sesterman furiously demanded the driver move, but the driver and his helper spoke a language he didn't understand. As they unloaded their truck, Sesterman stood there, cursing and frustrated. Meanwhile, Shannon and Darren drove out of the container terminal, heading for the self-storage unit. Shannon, still shaking, said she felt as though she was running through tar and was sure Sesterman would catch her. Darren, grinning, reassured her that Sesterman would be stuck at the trucker's whim for at least an hour. He also laughed off her concern about police involvement, explaining that Sesterman wouldn't risk his political career by alerting the authorities. When they arrived at the self-storage unit, it was deserted. Shannon hurried to unlock the padlock on Sesterman's unit, while Darren retrieved a pair of bolt cutters from the trunk. He used the cutters to quickly break the padlock on their own storage unit and opened the door with enthusiasm. However, upon entering, Darren found the unit empty and frantically searched the space. He spun around, grabbed Shannon by the shoulders, and shook her, demanding to know where the briefcases and money were. Shannon pulled away, her confusion matching his, and went over to the empty shelving unit. She insisted they had left the briefcases and money there, but now they were nowhere to be found. Darren, panic-stricken, exclaimed that Sesterman must have taken the briefcases. Shannon insisted she had seen them on the shelf before they locked up. Darren, now pale and terrified, feared the Russians would end them if they didn't get the money. Shannon yelled, grabbing at Darren's arm, "We can talk to them. We can pull another con and then pay them back." "Let me go, you stupid witch!" Darren screamed at her, shoving her so hard that she fell to the concrete floor, bruising her hip. "I've got to get out of here." Ignoring her pleas, Darren rushed to the car, only to be blocked by two black SUVs that pulled into the driveway. Several men quickly surrounded him, bound his hands, and forced him into one of the SUVs. Shannon stood paralyzed as rough hands grabbed her, twisting her arms behind her and binding her wrists with plastic bands. She was shoved into the SUV with Darren, where her ankles were also tied. Terrified, she glanced at Darren, only to see one of the men pull a burlap sack over his head. Then a similar sack was placed over her face. She pleaded with her captors, but a harsh voice ordered her to be silent, which she did out of fear. As the car sped up, Shannon recalled Robert's account of a mob execution and began sobbing, terrified of the possibility of her face being blown off inside the bag. Tears streamed down her face and her breathing grew labored. She despaired over her situation, hoping someone might see them and call the police, but then remembered the tinted windows and sank into self-pity. She questioned her own morality and reflected on how she had wronged others, including her family and an old man they had cheated in Wilmington. Desperate, she tried to remember any prayers her father had taught her, promising to change her life if only she could be spared, but she could recall nothing. She slumped in despair, feeling a mix of anger toward Darren and herself. Darren's whimpering and the pain from her bruised hip reminded her of his cowardice in fleeing without her. The car made a sharp turn onto an unpaved road, and Shannon's fear spiked, realizing they were likely headed to a landfill. She sobbed uncontrollably, gripped by the horrifying prospect of their fate. The SUV suddenly slammed to a halt, almost throwing Shannon forward into the seat in front of her. Without warning, the door next to her was flung open, and she yelped as hands began to grope her legs. "Stay still," a rough voice commanded, and then the plastic band around her ankles was removed. A hand grabbed her and yanked her out of the vehicle. She was led forward, and she could hear Darren shuffling along beside her. They stumbled across uneven terrain for about 20 yards before coming to a stop. Strong hands gripped her shoulders and forced her down onto her knees. The rocky ground felt harsh, but in her terror, Shannon barely registered it. A voice from one side asked, "How much longer until we're done?" "5 minutes at most," another voice responded. Shannon was initially confused, but the grim reality hit her fast. She had less than 5 minutes left to live. As she began to collapse, a hand roughly yanked her back up. While she knelt there, trembling with fear, she heard footsteps approaching from behind, and suddenly light pierced through the burlap bag over her head. "It must be the car headlights," she thought, and then she screamed as she felt a hand on the back of her head. At that moment, the bag was ripped off her head, and she was blinded by bright light. All she could see were a pair of legs standing in front of her. "Is this what you wanted?" a bitter voice asked, and Shannon gasped in shock. "That sounds like Robert's voice," she thought, unable to believe it. The voice continued, "Is this really the life you wanted? Living like a common criminal, always on the run with someone like him?" Shannon realized with certainty that it was indeed Robert speaking. Robert's voice grew softer but was charged with emotion. "I would have given you anything, Shannon. I would have done anything to make you happy. I would have taken a bullet for you." Overcome with shame and sorrow, Shannon could only hang her head. With a sharp motion, Robert reached into his jacket pocket. Shannon flinched involuntarily, expecting a tool, but instead, he pulled out an envelope and threw it on the ground in front of her. "Since you wanted it so badly, here are your divorce papers," he said with a bitter tone. He glared at her for a moment, then lifted his gaze to scan the others. "I'm finished here. You can take over from now," he said, turning his back on the kneeling pair as he walked away. One of the figures standing outside the pool of light spoke up. "All right, everyone, the show's over. Let's get back to our duties." Shannon and Darren were yanked to their feet. With their hands still bound behind them, they were led to the SUV and pushed into the back seat. Someone tossed the envelope into Shannon's lap. Within minutes, they were driving southeast on the highway. Darren was the first to regain his composure and demanded angrily, "What the hell was that all about?" The person sitting in the front passenger seat turned around, revealing an attractive African-American woman. "That was just a little professional courtesy for a fellow FBI agent who wanted to confront his ex-wife," she explained. "We thought we'd add some drama for effect." "The FBI?" Darren sneered. "I should have guessed. How long have you been chasing us?" The agent laughed. "You two are small-time players. We weren't even targeting you. We used you to catch the real criminals, the mafia. We rounded them all up this afternoon." Understanding dawned on Darren, and he snapped. "So you were the ones who took the money from the storage locker?" The woman just smiled. "Of course we did. It's evidence, after all." Darren shot her a look of pure hatred. "You freaking bastards," he swore. The agent shot back. "You idiot, you should be grateful. If we hadn't made the arrests, your Russian pals would have ended both of you as soon as you got the money from the locker. We've been watching you and them for a while. We heard their plan." Shannon gasped, and Darren's bravado disappeared. After a pause, Shannon asked quietly, "Where are we headed now?" For the first time, the agent looked directly at her. "We're going to Essex County Jail," she said. "What did you expect?" Shannon let her head droop to her chest, and the agent glanced back and forth between the two in the back seat. After a moment, she looked at Shannon with a puzzled expression and asked, "Why would you leave Robert Cunningham for this loser?" Unable to meet the agent's gaze, Shannon mumbled, "I guess I've always been drawn to bad boys." With contempt, the agent responded, "What bad boy? You mean this pathetic guy who's wet his pants?" Looking over, Shannon noticed that Darren's jeans were drenched. When he saw her glance, he turned away to stare out the window. The driver cursed under his breath. "He wet himself? Great, now I have to clean the back seat again." The female agent laughed, then turned back to Shannon. "You wanted a bad boy? You were married to one of the toughest FBI agents on the East Coast. That man has more bravery awards than most agents get in their entire careers. Your ex-husband has taken down mob bosses, bank robbers, and you were looking for a bad boy?" "I didn't know," Shannon said quietly. The agent responded harshly. "Yeah, you didn't know, and you nearly ruined him. A lot of us thought he wouldn't survive after you left him. He loved you so much, and you treated him like he was trash." Taking a deep breath to calm herself, she continued, "But after tonight, I think he'll be okay. When he's back on the market, there will be plenty of single women in the bureau eager to meet him. And you know what? I might just be one of them." The driver teased, "Damn, Alice, I thought you were interested in me." Alice laughed and playfully nudged his shoulder. "Shut up, Ray. You know your wife would end you if she heard you say that." Before any more could be said, the driver announced, "We're here," and took a sharp turn into the Essex County Correctional Facility's admitting area. Shannon and Darren were escorted into the building and down a corridor. As they walked down the brightly lit hallway, Alice took Shannon's arm and guided her to the right, away from Darren. They reached an empty holding cell, and after directing Shannon inside, Alice slammed the door shut and walked away. Shannon collapsed onto the cot that was chained to the wall, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The intense experiences, from the adrenaline of the sting on Sesterman to the fear of impending death, from the relief of surviving to the humiliation of Robert's confrontation, had left her emotionally drained. Feeling relief at being separated from Darren, she thought about how he had tried to save himself at her expense. "Even if he hadn't tried to ditch me," she mused, "his Russian friends would have ended us anyway. What was I thinking, considering running away with someone like him?" she scolded herself. Her mind then wandered back to what the female FBI agent had said about Robert. She sees him as a hero, Shannon realized. She even thinks he's attractive. A loud noise from somewhere in the building made her glance up. The sight of the barred door reminded her of the grim reality she faced. The idea of spending years in prison was overwhelming, and she knew she had only herself to blame. Just then, the female agent appeared at the cell door. She unlocked it and motioned for Shannon to follow. "Let's go," she said, guiding Shannon down a hallway that led to a door. As it opened, the cool night air hit Shannon's face. They had reached the parking lot, and a car was waiting with its engine running. Shannon stared at the agent, puzzled. "What's going on?" Without a word, the agent directed her toward the waiting car. As the door opened, a figure she recognized stepped out. "Daddy?" she exclaimed, unable to believe her eyes. Rushing to him, she wrapped her arms around him and began crying into his coat. "I'm so sorry, Daddy. I'm so sorry for everything," she wept. Let's get going, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick with emotion, guiding her to the passenger seat of his car. What's happening? Where are we headed? She asked. We're going home, sweetheart, he answered softly. But why am I free? How did you know to come get me? She questioned, her voice full of confusion. As he drove down Doremus Avenue toward the New Jersey Turnpike on-ramp, he looked at her. Robert contacted me, he explained. He asked me to pass on a message. Tell her this is a parting gift from SpongeBob? A sharp gasp escaped Shannon and she started crying again. She was torn between seeing her unexpected freedom as a gesture of mercy from Robert or as a cruel punishment.